Hi everybody, it's Haley here with Nicole as well from OMX. Thank you for joining today's webinar to engage Canadians on the work that Avicen is doing in identifying the key industrial capabilities, KICs, for Canada to focus on through its procurement going forward. OMX is pleased to be working with Avicen on this initiative, particularly in helping to provide data on the Canadian industrial base, academic research capabilities, and collaborating with them to engage key stakeholders in order to seek feedback on the direction of their findings. For those of you who don't know OMX, we're an online platform used by the government, industry, and academia to connect, manage, and analyze data on the industrial base, as well as track the impacts from government procurements. The purpose of today's webinar is really about seeking feedback, and we want to encourage you all to ask questions throughout the presentation. There is an option on your GoToWebinar app to write in anything you want to ask the presenters. So by all means, feel free to use that throughout the presentation if anything that pops into your head. I will be moderating the questions, and if there's anything that's similar, obviously grouping them together and asking them at the end. There's also an online forum where you can submit additional feedback after the fact, and that link will be sent out in a follow-up email. So again, please don't hesitate to ask. We want your opinions and questions asked. The agenda for today's webinar is the following. Avicen will be providing an overview of their findings and some data surrounding KICs. The presentation will take about 30 to 40 minutes, and we'll leave 10 minutes at the end for question and answer and dialogue. It may be up to 20 minutes depending on how much volume we get. We again encourage you to use the online feedback form to provide further feedback. So with that being said, I would like to hand it over to the Avicen team. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay. My name is Doug Berenson. I'm a managing director here at Avicen. I'm joined by a colleague, Alex Jovovich, who's worked on this project with me and a number of others. Just a quick word about Avicen itself, for those of you who don't know us. Avicen is a management consulting firm. We are headquartered in Washington, but we have offices in Ottawa and a number of other cities around the world. We work really in government-driven markets, what we refer to as government-driven markets. So any market where the government, its role is a central feature in shaping how the market functions. So defense is sort of the centerpiece of our work because the government is the central customer. But we also work in areas like space and public safety and a few others. We have been working with Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada on various projects for a couple of years now, including this one related to key industrial capabilities. That work has involved a number of different elements, which I'll touch on in a moment. Our intention today is to brief out a provisional list of key industrial capabilities and to talk about how we envision that list potentially being used in implementation. I think we would very much like people's feedback on this. As Haley and Nicole mentioned, there's an online feedback mechanism. We encourage you to use that. If you'd like to talk with us directly offline, we're also happy to accommodate that as well. So with that, let me move forward and just talk about the process that we have gone through to look into this area. We started with ISED in 2015, and that work really began with a look at the non-Canadian world. We looked around the world to examine how the rest of the world prioritizes and protects its defense industrial base, or at least key sectors of its defense industrial base. That work yielded a report to government that we briefed to a meeting of ADMs in the April 2015 timeframe, April 2016 timeframe. And from there, we really pivoted to the Canadian context. We did a lot of outreach with Canadian industry. In fact, we probably talked with many of the firms who are tuned in now in our initial round of consultations. Talked with a lot of people in government about what they thought KICs should do and KICs should be. And we went about generating a list of key industrial capabilities through more or less the summertime in 2016. Spent the latter portion of 2016 briefing that provisional list through government. We're fortunate enough to brief a cabinet committee in December of 2016 on that provisional list, and they gave us approval to move forward and engage a broader set of stakeholders, including industry and academia and the provinces and territories. And so that's what we're doing now. We owe our clients at ISED a final report at the end of this month, March 31, and so we think we're on track to do that. So just in terms of the objectives I have for today, the goal of these engagements really is to refine the preliminary list of KICs that I will show you today, and to get advice on the path to implementation, which is as probably important as the composition of the list itself. We really want to synthesize perspectives from a number of different corners. We have talked to regional development agencies and provincial governments, a lot of companies. We had a session with academic institutions this week. We really want to try and get a broad swath of opinion on what people think about key industrial capabilities in this context. Now, I want to take a moment here and impress upon you that everything you're going to hear in this webinar is Avocent's opinion. That while ISED has been very supportive of our work in looking into this area, what we're going to show you here is not government policy, or at least not yet government policy. It is, again, our expert opinion, and so please take it as such. So I will provide a little bit of context behind all this before I get into the work itself. Most of you, perhaps even all of you, are aware that this is obviously not the first time that Canada has looked into this issue. The Jenkins panel reported out in 2013 and recommended the government adopt a set of key industrial capabilities as part of a broader defense procurement strategy aimed at growing Canada's defense industrial base and seeing to the maximizing the industrial benefits that could flow from it. In our consultations with industry, I think it also bears mentioning here that we heard a real clamor and thirst for greater transparency and clarity on how the government intends to support Canada's defense industrial base. How does the government intend to use value propositions and ITBs and other policy mechanisms? I think there's general support for these policies, but really a desire for greater understanding of how the rubber is going to meet the road. And then lastly, all of this is made manifest by the presence, the imminent presence, if you will, of a number of very large defense investments. Canadian Surface Combatant and the Future Fighter are probably the best known at this point, but there are many others as well. And the reason I mentioned that is that the procurements themselves loom very large for us here at Avocent in terms of being the primary mechanisms by which the government can have some of the effect that we think it ought to try and have. And I'll talk more about this when we get into matters of implementation. I'll also offer a quick word on the global context that is very relevant to the Canadian industrial base. Canada competes in a much more globalized defense sector than really was ever the case before. Once upon a time, you had a handful of exporting countries. Today, it's a much more varied landscape. You have countries like Turkey and Korea and Brazil and Poland much more active in the global marketplace, largely on the basis of industries that they have developed via offset policies of their own. And those governments and other governments, indeed more traditional exporters like France and others, are extremely active on the part of their domestic companies. So as Canadian firms compete in the world, they're increasingly facing a more difficult competitive landscape with increasingly aggressive players outside the usual suspects, if you will. And then finally here, just the nature of defense technology, I think, is also changing, and that's relevant in the Canadian context as well. And this cuts two ways. For one, you see defense technology really driving innovation and technology opportunities in commercial sectors. You can see this in drones, in cyber, in certain surveillance technologies. And it works the other way, where you see defense customers acquiring technologies increasingly influenced by commercial dynamics. So the whole C4I realm increasingly is being influenced by IT trends that are largely being determined in the commercial realm, where the rate of dynamism and innovation is just far, far more rapid than governments can plan. So with that, I want to define a few terms before we get started into the list of KICs themselves. We've been asked a number of questions about how we're defining certain terms as we've been briefing this out, and I want to speak to some of those issues here. The central question I think that we've been asked is, how do you define a Canadian capability or a Canadian company? And that's a legitimate question given the particular structure of Canada's defense industrial base. The short answer for us is that any capability or company that has actual, what I'm going to for the moment call industrial operations in Canada, is for us a Canadian company, even if that company may be headquartered somewhere else. So if a company or a capability or some sort of institution or entity is doing design or development or manufacture or sustainment work in Canada with Canadian employees and a Canadian workforce, if it is generating economic activity in Canada, that is a Canadian capability in our minds. Again, the company could be headquartered outside of Canada, but our interest really here is to develop the industrial and related capacities that reside in Canada, regardless of where the company is headquartered. Now, while I'm on this slide, I'm going to try and speak to a couple of other terms of definition. We have also been asked, how do you define what a defense company is, understanding that there are many firms that do much more than just defense. And the answer to that is also reasonably straightforward. I think that we are trying to address here any company that would self-identify as having defense as a notable line of business. Even if it's a minority of their revenue, even if they have a very closely relevant commercial capabilities, as long as they see themselves as a defense player, as long as they truly are generating revenue from defense sources, although not necessarily as a prime contractor, that counts for us as a defense company. And while I'm on the subject of prime contractors, I also want to really urge you all to understand that when we talk about Canadian industry here, we really are trying to make this presentation encompass more than first-tier players, if you will, more than just prime contractors. We are trying to speak to a reasonable expression of the supply chain that exists within a series of defense sectors. Now, it's very easy to think about the household names when you think about the Canadian defense industry, and that's fine. But we are really hoping that this is relevant to more than just those famous firms. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I move along here. Oops, sorry. So when we talk about key industrial capabilities, I want to frame this a little bit by what we do and don't have in mind in terms of what key industrial capabilities should be used by the government to do. And I'm going to begin on the right-hand side of this slide and really talk first and foremost about what KICs are not intended for in our view. First, we don't necessarily mean KICs to foreclose any possibility that a company not on the list can receive some sort of government support. This is not intended to be the be-all and end-all of the government's approach to the nation's defense industry. Similarly, I don't think we intend this list to be the most fulsome and static expression of Canada's industrial priorities. The government obviously has interests and priorities well beyond just defense, and we want to acknowledge that. Again, I'll probably speak to that a little bit more as I go on here as well. We also don't intend this list to inhibit competition in the defense marketplace. I think there's a lot of talk occasionally about sole source contracting and mechanisms similar to that. We are not advocating here that the KICs list be used to demand sole source contracting. Similarly, we are not trying to protect industries that exist in Canada with unnecessary buying behavior. I think that there was a time where we were having consultations with D&D, and I think that they were a little worried on occasion that we were going to advocate that anything on the list of KICs go to the front of the line in terms of what D&D needed to buy. That is not our intent. We don't want to get in the way of D&D's own sense of prioritization and requirements. Those are military decisions, and it's for D&D to decide. We're not aiming to preempt that prioritization. And then lastly, we are not trying to create industries in Canada that are not independently sustainable beyond normal government procurement. So what are KICs for? Well, from our standpoint, KICs are used for a series of purposes. First and foremost, I think they are intended to articulate a series of areas of priority where the government wants to drive future growth and investment. We also think that KICs ought to be used really to align government policies in a way that will channel foreign direct investment toward a set of national objectives and priorities. We want to use KICs to promote transparency in applying a series of existing policies, like offset policies and ITBs. We think that KICs can be used to generate spillover benefits in commercial realms to the extent that those sit adjacent to certain defense sectors. And then finally, we want to use KICs to reinforce certain clusters of innovation and economic activities and potentially give rise to the development of new clusters where that kind of innovation can really thrive. As I say at the bottom of the slide here, we know that KICs are not the only tool available to the government here. We think that KICs are probably best seen as a way of shaping the use of existing tools, or at least some existing tools. But there are other tools that the government may have at its disposal that it can bring to bear on behalf of Canadian firms outside of the KICs realm. So when we think about key industrial capabilities and what should be on that list, we started from the standpoint of trying to define what does it mean to be key? What makes an industry critical to Canada? And it occurred to us that there were three different rationales, each of which really had to be accounted for. So at the top of the slide here, there's the question of pursuing emerging growth opportunities. These are sectors where there is an opportunity for the government to foster the development and the growth of industrial sectors that may have great upside potential for the country, both in terms of commercial sales and broader economic value for the country. Secondly, we think it is legitimate to use KICs to advantage leading Canadian competencies. Canada's defense industry is characterized by a whole host of companies that are already globally competitive, that are out competing successfully in the world, employing Canadians, conducting exports, generating IP, and we want to recognize that and also use KICs to sustain that over time. One of the effects that we want the KICs list to have is to help the government of Canada help Canada's defense industry. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we see this playing out further into the brief. But one of the outcomes we really want to, or one of the realities of the Canadian defense market that is sort of elemental to our view of this, is that Canadian defense firms, to the extent that they are successful, they're successful because they're competing in a global marketplace. That Canadian government demand alone is almost never sufficient to make a Canadian defense company successful and sustainable over time. And given that truth, we want the government to create a little bit of wind in the sails, if you will, of Canadian companies. We want to make it easy for Canadian companies to go around the world and say that they are selling to their home government so that they can be successful when they try to sell to foreign governments. And then thirdly here is probably the most straightforward of the rationales for key industrial capabilities, and that is where the government needs to maintain strategically important capabilities. So these are industrial sectors that the government simply has to keep as operating concerns in order to satisfy sovereign strategic requirements. You know, these are sectors of the defense economy, essentially, where the government simply is not prepared to rely on foreign sources of supply, and so needs to maintain a core domestic capacity in times of crisis. So, how did we go about the task of selecting industrial sectors to populate the key industrial capabilities list? Well, we started by looking at the entirety of the Canadian defense industrial landscape. And this slide is in some ways a summarization of that. We looked across the total Canadian defense industrial landscape and came across, depending on how you count, somewhere between 55 and 60 discrete sectors of activity. Now, some of these are very, very strong and very renowned globally. Some of them are the opposite of that. You know, there are a handful of areas here where the Canadian capability may exist as in just a single company serving a single program. And indeed, that program and company may almost wither and go away once that program wraps up. We looked at this entirety of industrial sectors in order to collect data on where the depth and excellence and risk really lies. You know, this is all about mitigating risk and seizing opportunities. So I will take you to the next slide and talk for a little bit about methodology, a little bit more about methodology here. So we went about the task of collecting a lot of data about the Canadian defense industrial base. And we collected this information along several parameters. We started with the industrial base itself, the supply side, and we tried to look at questions of scale. So how many companies are we looking at? What's the total revenue being generated? What's the level of employment? We also look at some qualitative factors like the level of technical differentiation in a global perspective. Where are Canadian firms in the supply chain in various places? We also looked at the markets, the global markets, to which Canadian companies can potentially address themselves, so the opportunity space, if you will. And we looked at that from two perspectives. Number one was the current size of the global addressable market. So this is not just the market in Canada, this is the addressable market around the world. Again, understanding that there are many countries to whom Canadian firms probably cannot sell. And we also measured the growth of these markets. And this is a core competency here at Avocent, is doing a lot of market analysis and market forecasting, particularly in defense markets. And then finally, we looked at the government's own priorities. You know, what is the government going to buy and how does it think about sourcing? So in terms of Canadian procurement, we looked at what is the government going to buy, say it's going to buy, within the next 5 years. So we took this fairly narrow window. And again, the reason that we use this as a criteria is because we think that Canadian government procurement is a central tool to advance the cause of key industrial capabilities. And then lastly here is surety of supply. And this goes to the question of strategically important capabilities. You know, we had a lot of conversations with people in D&D about their perception of what is truly vital for the government to preserve as capabilities in Canada so that they are not reliant on overseas providers who may not necessarily have Canada's interests first. Now, we looked at all these criteria differently in these different rationales for criticality. And indeed, in making key industrial capabilities bubble up to the surface, we really sort of required them to satisfy more than one criteria, which is why you see sort of multiple bubbles, if you will, on this chart. So in emerging growth opportunities, the central criteria here, I think, really was this question of growth. What is the opportunity space that Canada's industry can potentially address itself to over time? You know, where is the opportunity? What is the upside that Canada can reap economically? Second, under advantage leading Canadian competencies, the central question we really asked ourselves was, how excellent and how distinguished is Canada's industry itself? You know, what does that industrial base look like, and what is the market that it is selling to? I'm going to touch on this in just a slide or two. And then finally, under maintain strategically important capabilities, the core criteria for us really was this question of surety of supply, largely as influenced by D&D's comments to us. So I won't bore you with this very much, just to make the point that we collected and analyzed a lot of data about the Canadian defense industrial base and the global market that it can address itself to. There's a little bit of a screenshot here of some of the analysis that we did to weight and rate various industrial sectors so that we could have a reasonably rigorous body of data on which to draw some of these judgments. And so out of that essentially flows this provisional list. So, so this is the list of 17 key industrial capabilities as we have currently structured it. And as you sort of sit and absorb the list of capabilities shown here, I want to make a few points about items on this list. Number one is that we have had a lot of conversations with people in industry and other stakeholders over the last month or so. And much of their feedback has really gone to the question of how do you identify these key industrial capabilities? What words do you use to describe them? And then also, how do you define them? And those are critical issues for us. Now, there are definitions for each of these key industrial capabilities toward the back of this brief. Now, in the interest of time, I was not inclined to go through all of that, but the definitions are available to you. And if you want that backup information, you know, please go to the feedback portal, and we will make these slides available to you. The definitions are really vitally important here. You know, in some cases, we're defining these key industrial capabilities very broadly on purpose. In other circumstances, we are defining these capabilities fairly narrowly, and again, on purpose. And that's because in some cases, we're trying to draw in a fairly wide expression of the supply chain serving these areas. And in other areas, we're really trying to drive the government's behavior toward industrial capabilities that really most need its attention. Now, when you look at this list, it's very easy to see these labels and think of the household names in Canada. You know, you can look at some of these categories like satellite subsystems and components, or training and simulation, or electro-optical systems, and think of a very famous company in Canada at the prime contractor or major subsystem level. And that's fine, but that is not the entirety of what we're seeking to capture here. You know, we really do want this to be relevant to a supply chain that may exist and serve those prime candidates. Now you can take that too far. You can go down to the the detailed raw materials or subcomponent level, at a level where companies may have no idea that they're serving defense customers or defense end users in the end. But we think that's that's a distraction. That there is a reasonable expression of the supply chain that can be addressable in these areas that are stated on the slide. Now, one more thing I would say about this list of key industrial capabilities. I think that we've gotten a lot of feedback over the last month or so, and the feedback has been on questions of what do you do with the list of KICs. It's been on, well, how are you precisely defining this list, but it has definitely also included, why am I not on this list? And I want to address that question here too. We intentionally wanted this to be a relatively short list. A minute ago I showed you a list of 56 or 60 industrial capabilities across the country that cumulatively describe the Canadian Defence Industrial Base. We intentionally wanted to narrow down fairly sharply from that longer list to something smaller where policy could be focused. Now, having said that, this is not cast in stone. I'm not telling you that the list as you're looking at it right now will be the list that features in our final report to our client. And so I don't want to panic anybody, but I also will urge you to understand that this list will probably have the greatest impact the shorter it can be kept. Now, also on that point, I will bore you with this slide and say that when you think about any one of these three rationales for criticality, you could set the metrics and the criteria for scoping down a little bit to the left or right and yield a different list. So under pursue emerging growth opportunities, we could have broadened the aperture to areas that have probably great economic opportunity, but where there's much thinner capability in Canada currently, and you would get a bigger list. Similarly, under advantage leading Canadian competencies, we set a threshold, a market size threshold of about $500 million per year in market size. If you set that dollar threshold a little bit lower, you'd end up with a longer list, and we are actively considering that in order to make sure that we encompass an appropriate expression of excellent Canadian defense sectors, those that really are active highly in the global marketplace. And under maintain strategically important capabilities, you could expand the aperture to include areas for which the government is the only buyer. Essentially a capability that would go out of business if the government of Canada didn't buy from it. We're not planning to do that now, but it is a legitimate way of looking at this. And again, I think that as we go through the feedback and talk with companies, these are some of the issues going to be on our minds as we think about what the final list looks like. So the next question is, regardless of what is on the list, what do you do with the list? And we think what you do with the list ought to be shaped principally by the objective that the government has for that portion of the list. So for example, under the first category of pursue emerging growth opportunities, we think the government's central objective here is to promote investment, R&D investment, and commercialization of emerging technologies, to ensure that Canadian firms are conducting R&D, have resources to conduct R&D, are getting incorporated into global supply chains and commercial supply chains such that they are growing into real generators of economic opportunity. Under advantage leading Canadian competencies, we think the government's primary objective there is to lend support for continued innovation and export success. That these are areas that where a lot of innovation is already taking place, where a lot of exports are already taking place. We want the government to make sure that that is sustained over time and that it can lend a reasonable hand without being too directive in making that come to fruition over time. And then finally, under maintain strategically important capabilities, the fundamental goal here is to ensure a domestic capacity in critical sectors. And so in order to have these, in order to serve these objectives and these policy aims, we think the government can use a set of existing policies and focus those existing policies and policy tools differently in these areas. Again, I'm going to go through the list here, or these three categories, and describe what I mean. So under pursue emerging growth opportunities, I'll focus here on industrial and technical benefits and value propositions. We think that the government could use value propositions to really focus foreign direct investment in Canadian companies and other institutions. That if a procurement features a value proposition that rests centrally on the R&D criteria, understanding that the value proposition has 4 notional pillars that can be exercised flexibly and selectively, that the government can drive foreign direct investment much more effectively than if the value proposition is defined in a much broader way. And similarly, if a company is making R&D commitments under that value proposition, in our estimation, it can enjoy multipliers for its ITB obligations to truly incentivize making credible and real R&D investments in Canada. Secondly, under leading Canadian competencies, I would also address myself to ITBs and value propositions here again. Again, what the government is looking to achieve here is to advantage Canadian companies without being too directive or too mandating. And so, in our estimation, the value proposition can be a tool here too. If the value proposition can be structured such that the central criteria is to draw on Canadian sources of supply, then bidders will be highly incentivized to make sure that excellent Canadian enterprises are on their teams to satisfy these requirements. And similarly, if they make those commitments in their value propositions, perhaps they too can enjoy a multiplier for their ITB commitments. And then finally, under maintain strategically important capabilities, for our money, the question of Canadian content mandates and sole sourcing really belong in this context. Now we understand that sole sourcing is in many ways not natural Canadian government behavior, and we understand that. But we think that in this area it is appropriate. In fact, it's most appropriate here. And our hope, I think, is to help the government articulate where and when it's going to use those very directive policies in the most limited way possible. Now, I'm also listing here on the right-hand side of the slide this question of government R&D programs, of which there are many in the Government of Canada, among a number of different relevant agencies here. We think that this can also be a tool that the list of KICs can inform. Now, obviously, many of those R&D programs are going to be informed by government priorities well outside the area of defense. So we don't want to argue that the KICs list is the be-all and end-all of the prioritization of Canadian government R&D. But we think that to the extent that the government is looking to allocate precious R&D resources in the defense realm, that the KICs list can be a very useful guide. Now, having talked about the use of KICs to shape government priorities, I also want to go back to a comment that I made earlier in the presentation, and note that there are a number of government policy tools that are available to advantage and help support the Canadian defense industry beyond whatever appears in the KICs list. And that's sort of the point I'm trying to make on this slide, that there are a number of other activities that the government can undertake to advantage and help Canadian industry thrive, particularly in a global marketplace. I'll pick a few just to comment on briefly here. Government-to-government programs and interoperability development, sort of featuring two different bullets here. There are a lot of ways in which the government can advantage the role of Canadian industry insofar as it is pursuing government-to-government arrangements on new technologies and new systems. There are also a variety of export sustainment programs and export advantaging programs that the government of Canada has at its disposal that we at Avocent, the government ought to use in a very muscular way on behalf of Canadian defense industry, because it is very clear that every other country does this also. And we think that ought to be available to Canadian firms, whether they feature on the list of KICs or not. So where do we go from here? As I said a little bit earlier, we owe our clients a final report in about a month's time. We are in the process right now of soliciting feedback from industry and from provincial and territorial governments and from academia, and I think we welcome that feedback. We've got a fairly full calendar of conversations with people, but there's room for more. And our intent is to submit a report at the end of this month. We cannot tell you at this moment in time what to expect in terms of what the final results of that will be or how the government will or will not embrace that. But we would ask you to stay tuned, because we're very hopeful that this will remain a significant feature of the government's work moving forward. So with that, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Doug. It's Nicole from OMX here. So I just wanted to thank you. That was a great presentation, and I know we've been very proud to work with Avocent, especially on data on the industrial base across Canada as you go through this process. So we have one question here. It's coming from an infrastructure company. So the question is, was infrastructure management considered part of the defense industrial base? In other words, the design, build, financing, maintaining, and the operating process. Was this included as part of the KIC review process, since it's clearly not as sexy as equipment procurement, but it is vital to the sustainment of defense capabilities in Canada?
Yes, no, that's a good question. We did look at it. We looked at it from a number of different perspectives. When we think of facilities and infrastructure, there's sort of a couple of different ways in which you can think about that. The question of deployable infrastructure is a big a point of interest for us. We've had a lot of debates with that section of the industry in Canada, which is fairly distinguished. And that's one that we're really sort of chewing on in our heads about where it wants to feature here. The more fixed industry infrastructure, the facilities management and operation outside of any deployable character, I think is legitimate to consider part of the broader defense industrial landscape in Canada. That is true. But we have, as you've seen on the list, not regarded it as a key industrial capability to date. In our view, it's the defense aspects of this are not so distinguished from broader commercial or civil activities that it didn't quite rise to the level of requiring particular government support in our minds. And to the extent that facilities are obviously located in Canada, it is almost by definition going to be Canadian employees and companies that do that work. Again, those companies may be owned by non-Canadian parents, but the work itself is not hard to keep in the hands of Canadians.
Thanks, Doug. The next question, I think I have a good idea of the answer on this. It just says, great data that you have, but do you have information collected down to the regional or provincial levels?
So we have collected information on the geographic footprint, if you will, of the Canadian landscape. So, for various key industrial capabilities, we can tell you, what is the breadth of capacity, by province and territory. As you can imagine, there was great interest on that point. Not surprisingly, you tend to see concentrations of KICs where you see concentrations of economic activity. There is clearly a clustering effect, as the government has clearly seized upon. But we can, there clearly are some geographic patterns that emerge in terms of where these KICs tend to cluster.
Yeah, and I know we've seen that as well at OMX. I've got another question that's come in here, and I know we covered this on, I guess it was yesterday, we did the academic-specific webinar, but just looking at whether Avocent looked at academics and researchers, incubators and accelerators to figure out the emerging growth opportunities, or did you solely focus on the industry perspective?
No, we definitely looked at academia as well. And again, I think that when you think about, when you talk about commercialization, it's an economic effect in terms of exports. It's very easy, indeed easier for us and for me, to talk about companies. And so I understand why I may have conveyed that impression today. But we absolutely looked at the contribution that academic institutions and, frankly, government institutions in some instances can have in creating, if you will, industrial capabilities in Canada. As we look at, the Waterloo-Kitchener area, I think clearly there is, in a number of disciplines related to ICT, a lot of dynamism and innovation going on there, and I absolutely think that is relevant to this conversation. Not just there, but just by way of example.
Yeah, I know we agree with that too. So we've got some more specific questions. I'm not sure how in-depth you'd like to go, but just a question asking you to comment on artificial intelligence and how that fits into emerging tech. And I think sort of for me to elaborate on that in that vein is obviously emerging tech is changing so quickly, and there's new technology in those industries. So how do you ensure that the kick around emerging tech will incorporate things like artificial intelligence and other changes that are happening way faster than any government policy would be able to change?
Yeah, it's a great question, and frankly, we have gotten asked that a lot about AI in particular. In fact, we've been asked, about AI from academia and from government and from industry. I think clearly a lot of attention and a lot of capability in Canada there. I think this goes to the question of how you draw the definitions for the key industrial capabilities that we've featured here. And we think that there are probably at least two of the key industrial capabilities that we feature currently that are centrally relevant to AI. And they include cyber resilience and robotic and autonomous systems. When we think of robotic and autonomous systems, this is another area where if you just read the bumper sticker label, it's easy to conjure a mental image of a drone, maybe carrying a weapon. And that's fine, that can be part of the definition, but we mean it much more broadly than that. We definitely mean it to include matters of artificial intelligence and machine learning and automation of any sort of machine-to-machine interactions where AI may play a role here. And again, I think that there's an area where, in our final report, we really are going to have to make sure that the definition comes through as crisply as possible, because we don't want the government only to privilege, drone makers, for example, when what we meant was something much broader and more varied than that.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Next question, we've had a few come in around the same theme, so I'll just try to bundle them into one question, and it's often coming in from SMEs, and it's basically how do they get on the KICs list, or how do they receive assistance from Canada? The way I would summarize the question or the theme here is there are a lot of SMEs on the line today, and what does this really mean to them? How will this impact them? And more specifically, how can they play in this government contracting space?
So when we think about the role of SMEs in KICs, we think that they can be fairly direct beneficiaries of this. That part of the effect that we really want to have here is to shape the behavior of government bidders. The government bidders are, by definition, prime contractors, but it is those firms whose behavior we want to shape and incentivize in a way that I think can redound to the benefit of SMEs here. If we use this list in a way that incentivizes prime contractors to source from Canadian sources of supply, SMEs will benefit. If we incentivize prime contractors to guarantee R&D investment in Canada, small and medium-sized enterprises can benefit from that investment. And so I think that they don't always show up, again, in terms of how the way you read the labels of the KICs as they are written. Again, it's very easy to see those and imagine the names of prime contractors that are famous in Canada. And that's fine as far as it goes, but we really do mean those areas to be broader than just, I'll say it out loud, CAE in training and simulation. There is a host of suppliers below CAE who are as legitimate in our eyes representatives of that training and simulation category as CAE itself. And so, to the extent that the government is incentivizing bidders to draw on Canadian sources of supply for a training and simulation acquisition, bidders should be scouring the Canadian countryside, looking for suppliers of that capability so that they can put forward a bid that includes sufficient Canadian content to make their bid as competitive as possible. And the same, I guess, I think can be true on the R&D side. You don't have to be a big prime contractor to benefit from R&D that's driven by a bidder, whether that bidder is foreign or Canadian.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, especially about focusing in on the potential impacts that can happen lower in the supply chains and lower tiers. So we are getting close to the cutoff. I don't know how much longer you'd like to go, Doug. There's a few comments in here that I think we can just forward over to you, and a few things about ordering and making sure that if something's the most important, why would you have it third? Some areas that potentially you might have missed. Yeah, there's a lot of comments coming through as opposed to very clear questions. So the only last question that I'm really seeing is about cross sectors. So what about companies who have capabilities in other industries such as mining? What have you thought about that?
So there's certainly been a lot of interest on the part of our government client to think about the relevance of defense activities to broader commercial activities, and for obvious reasons, I think. I think we really, that first area in our minds, of sort of areas of opportunity, emerging growth opportunity. I'm going to go back to this slide here. I think in some ways gets to that. I think that we're centrally looking at areas sort of defined by their defense relevance. But every one of those areas has clear application in commercial realms also. Again, I'll go to the list, at least as it exists now. That I think that we imagine that every one of these areas has commercial application. Whether they are relevant to mining, I'm not sure that I'm competent to answer that at this moment in time. But we want to support or have the effect of supporting R&D and innovation in areas that can be relevant to Canada beyond just the defense output.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer, and it promotes more long-term stability as well, right, if you've got business coming from multiple sectors. So Doug, did you want me to continue past 3 o'clock? There's There's about 4 more questions here. A few of them are not quick answers, so it's your call, and all the feedback, of course, will forward. And then for everyone on the line, please also go back to the landing page that was sent out, or you can provide feedback even just by email so that we make sure it's all captured. So Doug, do you want me to continue? Or
Yeah, please do. I'm happy to stay on the line.
Okay. So the next question is, does the analysis assume the needed skilled labor supply is readily available in the market?
No, we do not necessarily assume that. In fact, a good body of the work that we have done for ISED outside the context of this project has touched on that very subject. Indeed, we can imagine one of our recommendations here to be to provide support through other programs for the kinds of skill sets that go into enabling these capabilities. And there's a lot of commonality across many, but not all of these in that realm. I imagine that will feature in our recommendations, but we understand that is it's a significant point of vulnerability, but it's also potentially an advantage for Canada, partly because I think its educational institutions, frankly, may be in a better position than those of its neighbors in producing the kind of talent that's needed.
Yeah, a lot of skills training and et cetera. There's been a few on this same theme around regions. So I think there's a lot of people that are really stuck on the definition of an IRB being about spreading sort of wealth regionally across the country. So there's a few questions which I'll bundle into one about how are the KICs distributed across the regions? Do some regions have more KICs than others? Does it give one region an advantage over other regions?
So as I said earlier, there is no doubt that there are concentrations of capability in Canada's defense industry writ large, and in these 17 key industrial capabilities in particular areas. Again, I think that I wouldn't argue that point that there is as much value being generated in Saskatchewan as there is in Ontario. Having said that, there is a pretty good distribution of defense, what I'm going to call in defense industrial activity across the country. There are areas in which it is highly geographically focused. Shipbuilding clearly is squarely a coastal undertaking, obviously. And that's an extreme example, but there are a few others. The Montreal cluster, as it relates to aerospace and aviation-related capabilities, is very distinguished, and that means that there is a concentration there. But there is a fairly broad footprint across the country represented in these examples. And with that in mind, I think to the extent that we can use this to drive investment and to drive supply chain roles, among other outputs, we can have a cross-country effect.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we've seen at OMEX just data all over the country, different capabilities. So I'm going to go back to the very first question we asked about infrastructure, and this is a bit more of a comment, but I'll just say it, just to say that D&D owns 47% of federal government buildings, represents $26 billion in real property assets, and consequently the maintenance and sustainment of the footprint is vital to defense mission success. So I guess the question or comment that's common is to consider infrastructure sustainment.
We would be happy to add that to the list of things that we really have to chew on, and I would not question the premise of the individual's question. I think it's a legitimate. Again, it may be an entirely legitimate issue in terms of enabling D&D to perform its mission. The question in our mind is it at risk? And is there some particular opportunity that exists by enabling it or advantaging it in some specific way? I think that we're happy to have that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Another question about how are the KICs evaluated for companies that really focus on foreign defense procurement, and so they're really solely exporting. So companies companies, for example, who don't rely on any Canadian domestic procurement. How have you analyzed those types of companies into your evaluation of whether or not they're a KIC?
That was almost immaterial to us as to whether they sell to the government of Canada or not. If they exist in Canada, if they're doing work in Canada, and indeed export was a big distinguishing feature for us, because anything that sort of drives a favorable balance of payments, for us was a real sort of star in the field. We included them in our look here. I think in terms of the effect that this will have, again, I think that we really want to recommend to the government that that it act as forcefully as it can in advantaging Canadian firms in export markets, and there are again a number of tools at the government's disposal to do that. And to the extent that the government itself does come around to buying some a capability that is relevant to that company, that it is in an advantaged position in terms of finding a place on competitive teams.
Okay, next question is really big picture in terms of looking at Canada's broader industrial policy, and how that policy should be executed, how it would mesh with the defense procurement strategy, maybe even the DAG and KICs. So I think it's a question just sort of stepping back and looking at the entire broader industrial policy and how you see this all fitting in.
Sure. So I'm at the risk of getting well out of my writ here, but I'll take a stab at it anyway and risk getting in trouble later. Look, we're very conscious of the fact that the government's innovation agenda hangs very heavy over all of this. Clearly the government wants to pursue a wide variety of sort of industrial support and innovation objectives. And from our perspective, that's a great thing. Even if the government is not specifically focused on defense as a central point of concern, we think all of the emphasis put in those areas can have a great effect in sustaining progress in this area. Now, partly that's because many of the areas listed here have relevance well outside of the defense realm, but part of it also is just the government's being willing to flex its muscles on behalf of Canadian industry. I think can only help the government do what we think needs to be done on behalf of industries in this particular sector. Defense, one other thing I will say is, one of the things that really is unique about defense is that the government has the legal latitude to advantage domestic firms. When you get outside of defense, you run into treaty obligations that complicate that fact. Under trade agreements to which Canada is party, defense companies can be advantaged in a way, or defense procurements can be managed in a way that almost any other government procurement cannot be. And we think that makes this a particular area worth focusing on. But again, we do think it fits into a broader approach to industrial policy and promoting innovation and exports and skills development and a number of other areas that ultimately yield to economic growth.
Okay, on that note, we are getting a lot of comments now coming in, and a lot of them are basically just people making cases for other KICs to consider. So we're going to forward all of those, but just maybe a few analytics of Canadian data, Arctic, planet sovereignty, planetary protection, planetary defense, solar systems. There's just a bunch of sort of longer pieces of feedback coming in about different areas for you guys to consider. So we'll make sure those are forwarded. I think the last
Yeah,
question really.
We're eager to see them. I think again we've in our conversations over the preceding weeks, I think we've probably encountered a number of these. You know, Soldier Systems is one that very recently we had some conversations about, and a few others. You know, I guess again we are open to receiving this feedback. I think we're eager to see it and to think anew about some of the judgments that we made.
Good. That's great. So I think I'll just say, maybe we'll end on saying, please get your feedback onto the online website, and I'll end on this final question, which is a great way to end it. Great initiative. Love your analysis and approach to keep this initiative alive over time as governments will change. Will you be recommending some means by which to keep the process alive, to continue to expand on and allow for evolving KICs and KICs to change as markets and needs change?
That's a terrific question, and I was remiss in not mentioning that in my remarks. We absolutely think that the KICs list has to be revisited from time to time. We've sort of nominally thrown out 5 years as maybe a window, and the questioner is right. Technology will change. The government's procurement priorities and appetites will change. Global markets will change, and I think the KICs list really needs to keep abreast of those developments. And so if there is sort of a built-in provision by which this list can be revised from time to time, hopefully it can also keep the government's attention on the use and the exploitation of that list.
Yeah, it's a great point. Don't want this to just collect dust on the shelf. So this is great. Thank you so much, Doug, for this presentation. Like I said, it's been a real pleasure to work with you at OMX, and we really appreciate you reaching out and seeking as much feedback as possible. So just for everyone on the line, please go online and provide additional feedback, and any emails that we're getting, and we've received a lot in the last hour, so this is fantastic. We'll make sure we forward that on to the Avicent team. So thank you very much, and like I said, it's been a real pleasure.
Great. Thanks very much, Nicole.
Take care.
Bye-bye.